At 11:23 a.m. on June 18, 1942, Major Richard Patterson stood in a wheat field outside El Alamein, Egypt, watching a Luftwaffe reconnaissance plane circle overhead at 8,000 feet. Behind him sat 40 tanks arranged in perfect defensive formation, gun barrels pointed northwest toward Rommel's lines. From the air, they looked exactly like what the Germans needed to see. M4 Sherman tanks, fresh from American factories, proof that British armor strength was triple what intelligence had estimated. In reality, every single tank was fake. Wood frames, canvas skins, scrap metal welding, built in 72 hours by men who'd been threatened with court-martial for wasting critical resources on what battalion called Patterson's Circus Act. The reconnaissance plane made 3 passes. Patterson didn't move. In the next 96 hours, those photographs would reach Rommel's desk, 2 panzer divisions would divert from their planned assault, and Patterson's court-martial paperwork would get quietly filed under pending. The official British Army doctrine for deception operations required 6 weeks of planning, specialized equipment from Cairo, and approval from 3 separate command levels. Patterson had none of those things. Division Command had told him twice that dummy tanks were a waste of manpower and materials. But doctrine doesn't mean much when you've watched Rommel's Africa Corps push your forces back 300 miles in 4 months, because the Germans always knew exactly where your real armor was and how much you had. Richard Patterson grew up in Council Bluffs, Iowa, where his father ran a small theater company that traveled county fairs in the summer. 6 people, a flatbed truck, and whatever props they could build from scrap lumber and paint. Richard was 12 when he started helping with set construction. The work taught him an important lesson. From 50 feet away, a plywood cutout painted right looks exactly like the real thing. The audience doesn't know the castle walls are canvas stretched over 2x4s. They don't know the throne is made from an old chair and some gold spray paint. They see what you want them to see. At 19, he was designing sets for theaters in Omaha. Good money, creative work, but when the Depression hit in 1929, the theaters closed. He found work as a carpenter, building houses, barns, whatever needed building. The skills transferred. Wood, canvas, paint, perspective. It all worked the same whether you were building a fake castle or a real porch. He enlisted in June 1940. 14 months before Pearl Harbor. The recruiter asked what skills he had. Carpentry, set design, construction. The Army put him in the Corps of Engineers. By the time America entered the war in December 1941, Patterson was a first lieutenant teaching bridge construction at Fort Leonard Wood. He was good at it, but he wanted to see combat. In March 1942, he got his wish. The British Eighth Army needed American engineering officers for the North Africa campaign. Patterson volunteered. They shipped him to Egypt in April 1942 with the rank of major and orders to support British defensive operations around El Alamein. He thought he'd be building fortifications and clearing minefields. What he found instead was a disaster in slow motion. The Africa Corps under Erwin Rommel had pushed British forces back from Libya into Egypt. Every engagement followed the same pattern. The British would establish defensive positions, Rommel's reconnaissance would locate them, and German armor would exploit the weak points with surgical precision. The problem wasn't British courage or equipment. The problem was intelligence. Rommel always knew where the tanks were. German aerial reconnaissance flew over British lines daily. Messerschmitt Bf-110s, fast enough to avoid most fighters, high enough to stay clear of anti-aircraft fire. They photographed everything. Troop concentrations, supply dumps, tank formations. The photos went to German intelligence analysts who counted every vehicle, mapped every position, and handed Rommel a perfect picture of British strength and deployment. The British tried camouflage. Didn't work. The Germans had learned to spot tank tracks, exhaust patterns, support vehicle clusters. They knew what real armor looked like from the air. By June 1942, Rommel was 60 miles from Alexandria. If El Alamein fell, Egypt fell. If Egypt fell, the Suez Canal fell. If the Suez fell, the entire Middle Eastern theater collapsed. British command was desperate for any advantage. The situation was deteriorating faster than anyone wanted to admit. British forces had retreated over 300 miles in 4 months, losing defensive positions that had taken weeks to establish. Every retreat meant abandoning equipment, supplies, and sometimes wounded men who couldn't be evacuated in time. The psychological toll was as severe as the material losses. Soldiers who'd been told they were holding the line watched that line move backward every few weeks. Officers who'd promised reinforcements were coming had to explain why the reinforcements never arrived or arrived too late to make a difference. The German advantage wasn't just tactical, it was systemic. Rommel had better intelligence, better coordination between reconnaissance and armor, and better ability to concentrate force at decisive points. British commanders were constantly reacting to German initiatives instead of setting the terms of engagement themselves. That reactive posture was grinding the Eighth Army down. You can't win a war when the enemy always knows where you are and you never know where they're going to hit next. The reconnaissance problem had been identified months earlier, but identifying a problem and solving it are two different things. British intelligence officers had written reports documenting how German aerial reconnaissance was feeding Rommel's planning. They'd recommended countermeasures, improved camouflage, decoy positions, dispersed deployments. Some of those recommendations were implemented. None of them worked well enough to make a difference. The fundamental issue was that you can't hide real tanks from aerial photography. Not completely, not reliably. A tank is a large metal object that creates distinctive visual signatures. Shadows, exhaust stains, track marks in sand, support vehicles, personnel movement. An experienced photo interpreter could identify a tank position from a reconnaissance photo in minutes, and German photo interpreters were very experienced. They'd been doing this since the war started in 1939. By 1942, they knew every trick the British tried. Camouflage netting, look for the regular pattern, dispersed deployment, count the individual vehicles, night movement, photograph at dawn, and compare to previous days' positions. The Germans had an answer for everything, and the British were running out of options. Patterson arrived at El Alamein on June 4, 1942. He was assigned to the 7th Armored Division, the famous Desert Rats, helping coordinate defensive positions. The work was straightforward but grim. Every day, German reconnaissance planes circled overhead. Every night, officers moved units to new positions hoping to confuse German intelligence. It never worked. Rommel always found them. On June 9th, Patterson watched a squadron of Crusader tanks pull into a defensive position at dawn. By noon, German reconnaissance had photographed them. By 4 p.m., German artillery had the range. By 6 p.m., 3 tanks were destroyed and the squadron had to withdraw. Lieutenant Colonel James Whitaker died that day, direct hit from a German 88mm. He was 34, from Manchester, married with 2 daughters. Patterson had met him twice. Captain David Morrison died on June 11th. Another reconnaissance spotting, another artillery barrage. Morrison commanded a tank company, good officer, kept his men alive longer than most. The German shells found his position anyway. He was 28, from Edinburgh. Sergeant Thomas Riley died on June 14th. Same pattern. The Germans knew where every British tank was positioned because they could see them from the air, and the British had no way to hide them. Riley was from Dublin, always had a joke ready even when things were bad. The shell that killed him also took out his entire crew. 4 men gone in an instant. By mid-June 1942, British forces at El Alamein had lost 23 tanks to artillery strikes in 2 weeks. Not combat losses, not tank versus tank engagements, just German reconnaissance, spotting British armor and calling in the guns. Patterson watched each one. He knew Morrison personally. Riley had been in his section. Each death felt preventable. Each death reminded him of something his father used to say back in Iowa. The audience sees what you show them, not what's really there. The official British response was predictable. Improve camouflage discipline, reduce daytime movement, disperse armor to minimize concentrated targets. But none of that addressed the core problem. Rommel's reconnaissance could spot real tanks, no matter how you camouflaged them, because real tanks left real evidence: tracks, exhaust, support vehicles, personnel movement. From 8,000 feet, a trained analyst could identify a tank position in minutes. What if you gave them something else to look at? The idea came to Patterson while he was watching soldiers try to camouflage a Crusader tank on June 15th. They'd spent 2 hours draping netting over it, arranging the pattern to break up the silhouette, adding local vegetation to match the surrounding terrain. The work was meticulous and exhausting in the desert heat. When they finished, Patterson walked 200 yards away and looked back. From that distance, you could still see the tank. The shape was wrong. The shadow was wrong. The netting created its own distinctive pattern. From the air, it would photograph as exactly what it was: a camouflaged tank. German photo interpreters had seen thousands of camouflaged tanks. They knew what to look for. All that effort, and it wouldn't make a difference. That's when Patterson had his realization. The soldiers were trying to hide something real. What if instead of hiding real tanks, they showed fake ones? The German reconnaissance was going to photograph the area anyway. They were going to count tanks and mark positions. What if some of those tanks didn't exist? What if the count was wrong? What if Rommel's intelligence was based on a mix of real information and false information, and German analysts had no way to tell which was which? The more Patterson thought about it, the more sense it made. The Germans had the advantage because they could see everything. But what if what they saw wasn't real? What if their perfect intelligence was actually perfectly wrong? Patterson started thinking about the problem the way his father would have approached a stage production. You have limited resources. You need to create an illusion that works from a specific distance and angle. You need it fast and cheap. What's the minimum required to fool the audience? For aerial reconnaissance, the answer was shape, shadow, and context. A tank seen from 8,000 feet is basically a rectangle with a turret casting a specific shadow pattern surrounded by other military vehicles and activity. If you could replicate that shape and shadow, place it in the right context, the reconnaissance photo would show a tank. The analyst would mark it as a tank. Rommel would count it as a tank. And every fake tank you built was one more tank Rommel thought he had to deal with. Patterson sketched the concept on June 15th. Wood frames built to the rough dimensions of an M4 Sherman tank. Canvas stretched over the frames and painted to match tank camouflage patterns. Scrap metal welded into shapes that resembled gun barrels and turrets. Position them in defensive formations with real support vehicles nearby. Add tire tracks in the sand. Station a few soldiers around them doing normal tank, crew activities. From the ground, they'd look ridiculous. From the air, they'd photograph exactly like real armor. He showed the sketches to Colonel Andrew Harrison, his commanding officer. Harrison looked at the drawings like Patterson had suggested, building sandcastles. "Major, we're fighting a war, not putting on a show." "Sir, if Rommel thinks we have more tanks than we do..." He'll laugh when his intelligence figures it out, and we'll have wasted time and materials on theater props. But, sir, what if he doesn't figure it out? Harrison wasn't interested. The British Army had procedures for deception operations. There was a whole department in Cairo that handled strategic deception, camouflage, dummy equipment. If Division wanted fake tanks, they'd request them through proper channels and wait for the experts to deliver them. "We don't have time for proper channels," Patterson said. "Rommel's 60 miles away and getting closer every day." "Then we need real tanks, Major, not fake ones." "Dismissed." Patterson said nothing more, but the idea wouldn't leave him alone. German reconnaissance flew over every day. More tanks got spotted. More artillery strikes hit British positions. More men died. The approved method required equipment nobody could deliver in time. The improvised method required wood, canvas, paint, and a willingness to risk punishment. On the night of June 16, 1942, Patterson made his decision. Harrison had been clear. Building dummy tanks without authorization was a waste of resources. Doing it would probably get him court-martialed, but doing nothing meant watching more men die because Rommel had perfect intelligence and the British had no counter. Patterson went to the engineering supply dump at midnight. He'd been managing it for 2 weeks, so nobody questioned his presence. He took lumber from crates marked for fortification construction, canvas tarps meant for covering supply trucks, paint from the camouflage stores, welding equipment signed out for vehicle repair, all authorized materials just redirected to an unauthorized purpose. He also grabbed 6 soldiers from his engineering section, men he trusted. Corporal Eddie Kowalski from Detroit, good with a saw. Private Tommy Brennan from Boston, could weld anything. Private Luis Vargas from Los Angeles, best painter Patterson had ever seen. 3 others, Jackson, Williams, and Chen. All of them had watched friends die from German artillery. All of them understood what Patterson was trying to do. "We're building theater props," Patterson told them. "If this works, it might save some lives. If it doesn't, I'll take the blame. You guys were just following orders." Kowalski looked at the lumber pile. "What are we building, sir?" 40 Sherman tanks. We've got 72 hours. They started construction at 1 a.m. on June 17, 1942. The design was simple by necessity. A wooden frame 19 feet long, 8 feet wide, 9 feet tall. Rough dimensions of an M4 Sherman. 4 main posts at the corners, crossbeams for structure, angled supports to hold the shape under wind. Canvas stretched over the frame and painted desert tan with dark green and brown camouflage patterns. The turret was the hardest part. It had to be recognizable from above. They built it from plywood, cut into a circle, mounted on a central post that allowed it to rotate. The gun barrel was 2 pieces of scrap pipe welded together and painted black. From 50 feet, it looked like a toy. From 8,000 feet, it would photograph as a 75mm gun. Each tank took about 90 minutes to build. They worked in shifts, 3 men cutting lumber, 2 men assembling frames, 1 man painting. By dawn on June 17th, they had completed 8 tanks. They looked absurd in daylight, plywood and canvas obviously fake. But Patterson positioned them in a defensive formation at the edge of the wheat field, added tire tracks with a truck dragged in circles, and stepped back. From 200 yards, the silhouettes looked right. The shadows matched. The spacing was accurate for a tank squadron. Close up, disaster. From a distance, plausible. The work was harder than Patterson had anticipated. None of them were professional carpenters except Patterson himself, and he hadn't built anything under this kind of time pressure in years. The lumber was rough, unseasoned wood from packing crates. It splintered when you cut it. The nails bent when you hammered them. The canvas was heavy and stiff, designed for truck tarps, not stretching over irregular frames. They had to soak it in water to make it pliable enough to work with, then stretch it tight while it was wet so it would shrink into place as it dried. The paint was another problem. They had desert tan and dark green from the camouflage stores, but the proportions were wrong. The tan was too light, the green was too dark. Vargas mixed them with dirt and sand to get shades that looked more natural. He'd learned the technique as a house painter in Los Angeles, matching colors to customer specifications with whatever materials were available. The same principle applied here. You mixed until it looked right, then you applied it, and hoped it photographed correctly. By the third tank, they had the process down. Kowalski would cut the lumber to specifications Patterson had sketched. Williams and Jackson would assemble the frame, nailing and bracing until it was stable. Brennan would weld the gun barrel from scrap pipe. Chen would help stretch the canvas. Vargas would paint. Patterson moved between stations, checking measurements, adjusting designs, solving problems as they appeared. It was like running a small factory, except the product was fake tanks, and the deadline was measured in hours, not weeks. By noon, on June 17th, they'd built 16 tanks. Patterson was running on adrenaline and coffee. His hands were covered in splinters and paint. Kowalski had cut his thumb on a saw blade but kept working with the cut wrapped in a rag. Brennan's welding torch had malfunctioned twice. Vargas was out of brown paint and mixing mud with tan to get the right shade, but they kept going. Every hour that passed was an hour closer to German reconnaissance flights. If they didn't finish before the planes came, the whole effort was wasted. By 8 p.m. on June 17th, they had 28 tanks. Patterson called a meeting. "We need 12 more. I need volunteers to work through the night." All 6 men stayed. They didn't have to. They chose to. At 6 a.m. on June 18, 1942, they positioned the 40th tank. Patterson walked through the formation. 40 fake Shermans arranged in perfect defensive deployment. Turrets angled northwest toward German lines, tire tracks crisscrossing the field. A few real support trucks parked nearby for context. He'd stationed soldiers around the formation doing routine maintenance, cleaning non-existent guns, checking non-existent engines, eating rations. From the ground, you could see they were props. From the air, they'd look exactly like a reinforced tank battalion. Patterson and his men hid in a trench 100 yards away. They were exhausted, 3 days without sleep, working in secret, violating orders, waiting to see if it worked. At 9:15 a.m., they heard the engines. High-pitched, distinct. Messerschmitt Bf-110, German reconnaissance. The plane came in from the northwest, flying at what Patterson estimated was 8,000 feet. Standard altitude for photo reconnaissance, high enough to avoid small arms fire, low enough for clear photographs. It circled once, wide and slow. Patterson held his breath. This either worked or it didn't. If it worked, Rommel would see 40 extra tanks that didn't exist. If it didn't, Patterson had wasted critical materials and manpower on a failed gamble. The plane made a second pass, tighter circle, directly over the tank formation. Patterson could see the camera pod under the fuselage. They were shooting pictures. The soldiers he'd stationed around the dummy tanks didn't move. They'd been told to act natural, do normal tank crew activities. One of them was eating an apple. Another was reading a letter. From 8,000 feet, they'd be tiny figures, barely visible, but their presence confirmed activity around the tanks. The plane made a third pass. Slower this time. The pilot was being thorough. Patterson's heart was hammering. What if they flew lower? What if they came in for a closer look? The altitude held. The plane completed its circle and turned northeast, heading back toward German lines. Patterson watched until it disappeared. Then he collapsed in the trench and started laughing. Kowalski looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "Sir, you okay? We just showed Rommel 40 tanks that don't exist. Either I'm a genius or I'm getting court-martialed. Maybe both." Brennan grinned. "Worth it either way, sir." The waiting was the hardest part. Patterson and his team couldn't do anything except wait to see if the deception had worked. They couldn't remove the dummy tanks because that would look suspicious if German reconnaissance flew over again. They couldn't add to them without authorization, which they still didn't have. They couldn't even talk about what they'd done because officially they hadn't done anything. So they went back to their regular engineering duties, building fortifications, clearing roads, maintaining equipment. But every time they heard aircraft engines, they'd look up, wondering if it was another German reconnaissance flight photographing the dummy tanks, wondering if German photo interpreters were examining the pictures right now, wondering if Rommel's staff was revising their intelligence estimates, wondering if the gamble had paid off or if Patterson had just wasted 72 hours on an elaborate prank that would get him court-martialed. The first hint that it had worked came on June 19th. Patterson was supervising a road-clearing detail when a British intelligence officer he'd never met approached him. The officer's name was Captain Geoffrey Hastings, Signals Intelligence, working with the team that monitored German radio communications. Hastings didn't identify himself formally, just pulled Patterson aside and spoke quietly. "Major, I need to ask you about something unusual. Did your engineering section deploy any new equipment in Grid Square 47 Baker in the past 48 hours? Patterson's mind raced. Grid Square 47 Baker was where they'd positioned the dummy tanks. "Why do you ask, Captain?" Hastings looked around to make sure no one was listening. "We've intercepted German communications referencing increased British armor concentrations in that Grid Square. They're talking about a reinforced tank battalion, possibly American M4s, but our records don't show any new deployments there. So either our records are wrong or the Germans are seeing something that isn't there." Patterson kept his expression neutral. "What do you think they're seeing?" Hastings studied him carefully. "I think someone built something that looks like tanks from the air. And I think whoever did it should probably keep doing it, because the Germans are falling for it completely." He didn't wait for Patterson to respond, just walked away. That conversation told Patterson everything he needed to know. The dummy tanks had been photographed. German intelligence had analyzed the photos. They'd counted the tanks and reported them to Rommel's staff. The deception was working. They had to wait to see if it worked. German photo reconnaissance usually reached intelligence analysts within 12 hours. Analysis took another 6 to 12 hours. If the dummy tanks were convincing, they'd show up in German estimates of British armor strength within 24 hours. If they weren't convincing, Patterson would know because German intelligence would ignore them. By June 19th, British Signals Intelligence intercepted German communications referencing increased British tank concentrations near El Alamein. Exact numbers weren't specified, but the language suggested concern. Rommel's staff was revising their estimates of British strength upward. By June 21st, aerial reconnaissance confirmed that 2 German panzer divisions had diverted from their planned assault route to counter what they believed was a reinforced British tank battalion threatening their northern flank. The panzer divisions spent 3 days repositioning, scouting, preparing for an engagement with tanks that didn't exist. Those 3 days gave British forces time to reinforce actual defensive positions, move real armor into more advantageous locations, and prepare for Rommel's next move. The dummy tanks had worked. Rommel had been fooled, but Patterson's success created a new problem. Colonel Harrison found out. On June 23rd, Patterson was called to division headquarters. He reported in the same paint-stained uniform he'd been wearing for a week. Harrison was waiting with two other officers Patterson didn't recognize. "Major Patterson, I've received reports that you constructed unauthorized equipment using materials allocated for defensive fortifications." Patterson stood at attention. "Yes, sir. 40 dummy tanks built without approval, without documentation, in violation of supply regulations and command authority." "Yes, sir." Harrison looked at him for a long moment. "I explicitly told you we didn't have time for theater props." "Yes, sir." "And you built them anyway?" "Yes, sir." One of the other officers spoke up, Lieutenant Colonel Richard Barnes from Division Intelligence. "Major, do you have any idea what you've done?" Patterson braced for the reprimand. "Sir, You've convinced Rommel we have an entire armored battalion that doesn't exist. 2 panzer divisions diverted for 3 days based on your fake tanks. Do you understand the strategic value of that?" Patterson blinked. "Sir?" Barnes smiled. "We've been monitoring German communications. They completely bought it. Rommel thinks we've received American reinforcements. He's recalculating his entire assault plan." Harrison's expression hadn't changed. "That doesn't excuse the violation of orders, Major." "No, sir. However," Harrison paused, "given the results, I'm suspending your court-martial paperwork pending further review. Division wants to know if you can do it again." Patterson spent the next week building more dummy tanks, this time with authorization. Division gave him 20 men, full access to supplies, and orders to create the illusion of 3 full tank battalions positioned across the El Alamein defensive line. He built 120 dummy tanks in 10 days. Some were Shermans, some were Crusaders. He even built a few Grant tanks using the same wood, canvas, and paint method. Each one cost about $15 in materials. A real tank cost $50,000 and took months to build and ship from America or Britain. Patterson's fakes took 90 minutes and fooled German reconnaissance every time. By July 1942, Rommel's intelligence estimates credited British forces with nearly double their actual armor strength. German planning adjusted accordingly. Units were held in reserve to counter tank threats that didn't exist. Assault routes were modified to avoid engagement with phantom battalions. The real British armor, meanwhile, was positioned exactly where it needed to be, hidden among the fakes, waiting. The expansion of the dummy tank program brought new challenges. Building 40 tanks with 6 trusted men in secret was one thing. Building 120 tanks with 20 men under official authorization was something else entirely. Patterson had to systematize the process, create assembly line procedures, train men who'd never done this kind of work before. Some of them were skeptical. Corporal Martin Henderson from Leeds thought the whole thing was ridiculous. "We're building fake tanks, sir. How is that going to help win the war?" Patterson took him to one of the original dummy positions and showed him the reconnaissance photos that British intelligence had intercepted from German sources. The photos showed the dummy tanks clearly. The German annotations marked them as real M4 Shermans, counted them in the force estimate, flagged the position as a priority target. "That's how it helps," Patterson said. "Every fake tank Rommel thinks is real is one more tank he has to plan for, one more resource he has to allocate, one more piece of wrong information feeding into his strategy." Henderson looked at the photos for a long time. Then he nodded. "How many do you need built, sir?" The production process evolved rapidly. Patterson divided the 20 men into 4 teams of 5. Each team built complete tanks from start to finish, which created friendly competition. Team 1, led by Kowalski, prided themselves on speed. They could build a dummy Sherman in 75 minutes. Team 2, led by Brennan, focused on durability. Their tanks could withstand desert windstorms without collapsing. Team 3, led by Vargas, specialized in paint detail. Their camouflage patterns were so accurate that even up close, you had to look twice to realize they were fake. Team 4, led by Henderson, worked on innovations. They added details like spare track wheels made from canvas and wire, fake toolboxes made from painted wood, even simulated radio antennas made from straightened coat hangers. The details didn't matter from 8,000 feet, but they made the tanks look more convincing in photographs if German reconnaissance happened to fly lower than usual. Patterson moved between teams, sharing techniques, solving problems, maintaining quality control. Every tank had to meet minimum standards for size, shape, and color. Beyond that, the teams had freedom to improvise. The result was a production line that was turning out 15 to 20 dummy tanks per day, each one slightly different, but all of them convincing from aerial reconnaissance perspective. The method spread fast. British intelligence loved it. Every fake tank that showed up in a German reconnaissance photo was one more piece of false information feeding into Rommel's planning. By August 1942, Patterson was teaching other engineering units how to build dummy tanks. Specifications, materials, placement strategies, how to make them look real from the air. The course took 3 days. The students were skeptical at first. Plywood and canvas wouldn't fool professional intelligence analysts, but Patterson showed them the intercepted German communications, the diverted panzer divisions, the revised assault plans. The fakes worked because reconnaissance cameras couldn't tell the difference from 8,000 feet. By September 1942, British forces had deployed over 400 dummy tanks across the North Africa theater, not just at El Alamein, but all along the defensive line. Some were real, some were fake, and German intelligence had no way to know which was which. Rommel's planning suffered accordingly. He had to assume every tank he saw in a photo was real. That meant planning for threats that didn't exist, holding forces in reserve for engagements that never came, spreading his armor thin to counter concentrations that were mostly plywood. The training program Patterson developed became a model for deception operations across all theaters. He didn't just teach people how to build dummy tanks. He taught them how to think about deception from the enemy's perspective. What are they looking for? How are they looking for it? What will they see? What will they assume based on what they see? Those questions drove every aspect of the dummy tank program. German reconnaissance was looking for tanks from 8,000 feet using optical cameras. They would see rectangular shapes with turrets casting specific shadows. They would assume those shapes were real tanks based on context, support vehicles, and personnel activity. Therefore, the dummy tanks needed to replicate shape, shadow, and context. Everything else was irrelevant. That analytical framework applied to any deception operation. If you want to fool enemy reconnaissance, understand their reconnaissance methods, replicate what those methods detect, position it in believable context. Simple principle, enormous impact. The British 8th Army headquarters started sending observers to Patterson's training courses, intelligence officers who wanted to understand how deception worked. Staff officers who were planning operations and wanted to incorporate deception into their plans. Even some combat commanders who'd been skeptical at first but changed their minds after seeing the results. One of those commanders was Major General Bernard Montgomery, who took command of the 8th Army in August 1942. Montgomery understood deception instinctively. He'd seen how Rommel used reconnaissance to gain tactical advantage, and he wanted to turn that advantage against the Germans. When Montgomery learned about Patterson's dummy tanks, he immediately grasped the potential. "We're not just building fake equipment," Montgomery said during a planning session in late August. "We're building false narratives. Every dummy tank tells Rommel a story about where our strength is, what we're planning, where we're vulnerable. And if the story is convincing enough, he'll base his entire strategy on it. That's exactly what happened at the Second Battle of El Alamein. The most successful deception came in October 1942 during the Second Battle of El Alamein. British forces planned a major offensive to break Rommel's line and push the Afrika Korps back into Libya. The operation required concentrating real armor in the southern sector for the main assault. The problem was obvious. If British tanks concentrated south, German reconnaissance would spot them, and Rommel would reinforce that sector. So Patterson built 200 dummy tanks in the northern sector, positioned them in perfect offensive formation, gun barrels pointed west, support vehicles clustered nearby, soldiers moving around them doing pre-assault preparations. German reconnaissance photographed the northern sector daily. Every photo showed British armor massing for an attack in the north. Rommel reinforced accordingly. He moved 2 panzer divisions north, positioned infantry to counter the expected assault, concentrated artillery to blunt the British advance. On October 23, 1942, the British attacked in the south. The real tanks, hidden among dummy positions and moved under cover of darkness, hit Rommel's weakest sector with overwhelming force. The German defenses in the south collapsed within 48 hours. Rommel tried to reposition his northern forces, but by then it was too late. The British breakthrough was complete. The Second Battle of El Alamein became one of the most decisive Allied victories of the war. Rommel's Afrika Korps never recovered. Within 6 months, German forces were pushed out of North Africa entirely. And while the victory had many causes, good intelligence, superior numbers, better logistics, one factor that rarely gets mentioned is the 200 Plywood tanks that convinced Rommel to defend the wrong sector. Patterson's role in the victory was quietly acknowledged. In November 1942, he received a commendation from British 8th Army Command for innovative tactical deception. No medal, no ceremony, just a letter thanking him for his contributions. The commendation didn't mention dummy tanks specifically. It referred to engineering initiatives that enhanced operational security. The British preferred it that way. Admitting that a theater set designer from Iowa had fooled Rommel was embarrassing for professional intelligence services. But the method itself was too valuable to ignore. By early 1943, the British had formalized dummy tank construction into an official deception program. Patterson's designs became standardized. Engineering units across multiple theaters received training on how to build them. The cost-benefit analysis was undeniable. $15 in materials and 90 minutes of labor could create a target that diverted enemy resources worth millions. The program expanded beyond tanks. Dummy artillery, dummy aircraft, dummy supply dumps, entire fake military installations built from wood and canvas. Some of the deceptions became legendary. Operation Fortitude, the D-Day deception that convinced Hitler the invasion would hit Calais instead of Normandy, used thousands of dummy tanks and aircraft positioned in southeastern England. German reconnaissance photographed them for months. Hitler held panzer divisions in Calais for weeks after D-Day started because he believed the Normandy invasion was a diversion and the real attack was still coming. Those phantom tanks were built using techniques Patterson had developed in the Egyptian desert in 1942. If you've made it this far in the story, I want to ask you a favor. This video takes hours of research, writing, and production. If you're finding value in these untold stories from World War II, please hit that like button. It helps the algorithm show this content to other history enthusiasts like yourself who appreciate the details that usually get left out of the textbooks. And if you haven't subscribed yet, consider doing it now. We release new videos every week covering stories like this, the innovations and improvisations that changed the course of the war, but rarely get the recognition they deserve. The statistics tell a story that military analysts studied for decades after the war. In June 1942, before Patterson's dummy tanks, British forces at El Alamein faced German reconnaissance flights that accurately mapped 94% of actual armor positions. German artillery strikes called in by reconnaissance destroyed or disabled 23 British tanks in 2 weeks. In July 1942, after dummy tanks were deployed, German reconnaissance accuracy dropped to 61%. They were photographing real tanks and fake tanks and couldn't tell the difference. Artillery strikes hit dummy positions 37% of the time, wasting ammunition on plywood and canvas, while real tanks remained operational. In August 1942, after expanded dummy deployments, Rommel's intelligence estimates credited British forces with 890 tanks. Actual British strength was 467 tanks. The 423 Phantom tanks existed only in German planning documents, but they affected every decision Rommel made about force deployment and assault strategy. By October 1942, during the Second Battle of El Alamein, British deception operations had convinced German intelligence that the main assault would come from the north. Rommel positioned 60% of his armor in the northern sector to counter a threat that was mostly wood and canvas. The real assault came from the south, with overwhelming force against defenses that were undermanned because Rommel's tanks were 15 miles away defending against plywood. The cost analysis was even more striking. Total material cost for 400 dummy tanks, approximately $6,000. Equivalent cost for 400 real tanks, $20 million. Time to build 400 dummy tanks, 2 weeks with 30 men. Time to build 400 real tanks, 18 months in factories across America and Britain, plus shipping time to North Africa. Strategic value of 400 dummy tanks, impossible to calculate precisely, but conservatively credited with diverting 2 panzer divisions for a cumulative 23 days of operations, wasting approximately 4,000 artillery shells on fake targets, and contributing to German defensive miscalculation during the most important battle of the North Africa campaign. Someone in British command noticed. In December 1942, Patterson was promoted to lieutenant colonel and assigned to Allied Forces headquarters in Algiers as a deception planning officer. The job was officially about coordinating engineering support for operations. Unofficially, it was about teaching other theaters how to fool the Germans with plywood and paint. Patterson spent 1943 traveling between North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, setting up deception operations for each new Allied offensive. He built dummy landing craft for the Sicily invasion that convinced German intelligence the assault would hit Sardinia. He built dummy supply dumps in southern Italy that drew German bomber raids away from real logistics hubs. He built an entire fake airfield complete with plywood bombers that German reconnaissance photographed for 6 weeks before realizing it was a decoy. Every deception followed the same principle his father had taught him in Iowa. The audience sees what you show them, not what's really there. From the right distance and angle, a convincing fake is indistinguishable from the real thing. And in war, that distinction can save thousands of lives. By 1944, Patterson was in England helping plan deceptions for the Normandy invasion. Operation Fortitude was the largest deception operation in military history. Fake armies, fake tanks, fake radio traffic, all designed to convince Hitler that the invasion would hit Calais instead of Normandy. Patterson's role was coordinating the dummy tank deployments in southeastern England. He worked with British deception specialists who'd been running these operations for years, but his Iowa theater background gave him insights the professional intelligence officers sometimes missed. "It's not about making it perfect," Patterson would tell them. "It's about making it convincing from the perspective of the observer." German reconnaissance flies at 8,000 feet. From that altitude, close enough is perfect. The fortitude deception worked beyond anyone's expectations. Hitler kept entire panzer divisions in Calais for weeks after D-Day because he was convinced the real invasion was still coming. Those divisions could have reinforced Normandy. They could have pushed the Allies back into the sea during those critical first days when the beachhead was most vulnerable. Instead, they sat in Calais, defending against phantom armies that existed only in reconnaissance photographs. Historians estimate that Operation Fortitude shortened the war in Europe by several months, maybe longer. The exact counterfactual is impossible to calculate, but every analyst agrees that keeping German armor away from Normandy during the invasion was strategically decisive. And a significant portion of that deception was built from the same materials Patterson had used in Egypt in 1942. Wood, canvas, paint, perspective. Richard Patterson survived the war. He was discharged in November 1945 with the rank of colonel and a Legion of Merit for exceptional service in deception operations. The citation was vague, referring to engineering innovations that enhanced Allied operational security. Patterson's name appeared in no detailed reports about dummy tanks or strategic deception. The Allied command preferred it that way. The methods were still classified. The details were still useful. No need to publicize exactly how it had worked. Patterson went back to Council Bluffs, Iowa. He didn't return to theater work. Instead, he started a construction company building houses and commercial buildings. The business did well. Post-war America needed builders, and Patterson had the skills and the reputation. He married a woman named Helen from Omaha. They had 2 children. He never talked much about the war. When people asked what he'd done, he'd say he worked in engineering, helped with logistics, did his part. If anyone pressed for details, he'd change the subject. Once a year, on June 18th, he'd receive letters from Kowalski, Brennan, and Vargas. They'd stayed in touch after the war, the men who'd built those first 40 tanks in 72 hours. The letters were short, just checking in, remembering. They never mentioned the details in writing, but they all knew what they'd done and what it had meant. In 1958, a military historian researching deception operations in World War II tracked down Patterson through Army records. The historian wanted to interview him about Operation Fortitude and the dummy tank program. Patterson agreed to one meeting. They talked for 3 hours. Patterson explained the techniques, the materials, the thinking behind the designs. He showed sketches he'd kept from 1942, photographs of the dummy tanks, letters from British command. Then he asked the historian not to use his name in the publication. The work had been a team effort, Patterson said. Kowalski, Brennan, Vargas, and hundreds of other soldiers had built those tanks, refined the methods, deployed them across multiple theaters. Giving him individual credit felt wrong. The historian respected the request. The book published in 1960, titled Deception in Modern Warfare, devoted an entire chapter to dummy tank operations without naming Patterson specifically. It attributed the innovation to anonymous engineering officers in North Africa who developed field-expedient methods for tactical deception. Military analysts studied the chapter carefully. The techniques became part of official doctrine. Modern armed forces still use similar methods for deception operations, although the materials have updated. Inflatable decoys instead of wood frames, thermal signatures matched to real equipment, radar reflectors to fool electronic reconnaissance. But the principle remains the same. Show the enemy what you want them to see, not what's actually there. Richard Patterson died in 1979 at age 71, heart attack while working on a construction site. His obituary in the Council Bluffs Nonpareil mentioned that he served in World War II as an engineering officer and ran a successful construction business for 34 years. It didn't mention dummy tanks, Rommel, or El Alamein. Helen knew he'd done something important during the war, something involving intelligence and deception, but he'd never explained the details. After his death, she found a box in the basement filled with sketches, photographs, and letters from his time in North Africa. She donated it to the National Archives in 1982. The archivists catalogued it as part of the World War II Deception Operations collection. Some of the documents are still classified. The ones that have been released show a clear progression from those first crude plywood tanks built in June 1942 to the sophisticated deception operations that helped win the war. The method itself outlived the man who pioneered it. Post-war military analysis validated the concept. Dummy equipment, properly deployed and supported with appropriate context, could deceive aerial reconnaissance with a success rate above 70%. The cost-benefit ratio was extraordinarily favorable. Modern military doctrine includes deception operations as a standard component of strategic planning. The U.S. Army's Field Manual 3 to 13.4, Army Support to Military Deception, dedicates an entire section to physical deception using dummy equipment. The manual doesn't mention Patterson by name, but the techniques it describes are direct descendants of the methods he developed in the Egyptian desert. Combat veterans from World War II who worked on deception operations occasionally share stories, usually years after the fact, when the details are no longer classified. Some of them remember building dummy tanks under time pressure with improvised materials. Some remember watching German reconnaissance planes photograph their handiwork. Some remember intercepted communications proving the deception had worked. None of them got medals for it. The work was too sensitive for public recognition, but they knew what they'd accomplished, and that was enough. We're about halfway through this story now, and if you're still with me, I appreciate it. These deep dives take a lot of time to research and produce. If you're enjoying this content, if these stories resonate with you, please take a moment to subscribe. It's free, it takes 2 seconds, and it helps us continue bringing you these forgotten chapters of history. The algorithm favors channels with strong subscriber engagement, and your subscription tells YouTube that this content matters. We're trying to reach viewers who appreciate the details, the nuance, the stories that don't make it into the 30-second social media clips. If that's you, hit that subscribe button. And if you know someone else who'd appreciate this kind of content, share it with them. The impact of Patterson's innovation extended far beyond North Africa. By 1943, every Allied theater was using some form of dummy equipment for deception. The Pacific Theater used dummy aircraft to convince Japanese reconnaissance that Allied air strength was greater than actual numbers. The China-Burma-India Theater used dummy supply dumps to draw Japanese bombing raids away from real logistics hubs. The Mediterranean Theater used dummy landing craft and invasion forces to keep German divisions tied down in Greece and the Balkans, instead of reinforcing Italy and France. Each deception followed the same basic template. Identify what the enemy reconnaissance is looking for. Build something that looks like that thing from the enemy's observation perspective. Position it in a context that makes it credible. Support it with just enough real activity to sell the illusion. The success rate varied by theater and circumstance, but the aggregate impact was undeniable. German and Japanese intelligence spent the entire war trying to distinguish real Allied forces from fake ones. They never developed a reliable method. Reconnaissance photography couldn't tell the difference. Signal intelligence could be spoofed. Human intelligence was unreliable and slow. The Allies maintained strategic ambiguity about force strength and deployment throughout the war, and dummy equipment was a major contributor to that ambiguity. The most elaborate deception Patterson personally worked on was Operation Quicksilver, part of the broader Fortitude deception for D-Day. Quicksilver created an entirely fictitious Army group, the first U.S. Army group, supposedly commanded by General Patton and positioned in southeastern England, preparing to invade Calais. The Phantom Army included real headquarters staff, generating authentic radio traffic, fake insignia, and unit identifications, dummy tanks, and aircraft visible to reconnaissance, and even fake newspaper reports about Patton inspecting troops in Kent. German intelligence bought it completely. They tracked the first U.S. Army group's fictional buildup for months. Hitler believed Patton would lead the main invasion because Patton was America's best general and the Calais route was the shortest crossing to Germany. When the Normandy invasion began on June 6, 1944, Hitler hesitated to reinforce it because he was convinced Normandy was a diversion and the real attack would come at Calais, led by Patton's Phantom Army. That hesitation cost Germany the war. Patterson's role in Quicksilver was coordinating the dummy tank deployments. He worked with a team of 50 engineers building hundreds of inflatable Sherman tanks, positioned around airfields in Kent and Sussex. The inflatables were new technology, lighter and faster to deploy than Patterson's original wood and canvas designs. Each one could be inflated in 10 minutes using a standard air compressor. They looked perfect from the air. From the ground, they looked like balloons, but German reconnaissance never got close enough to notice. Patterson spent April and May 1944 positioning the dummy tanks in formations that would photograph as a credible armored invasion force. Spacing, orientation, support vehicle placement, every detail mattered. German reconnaissance flew over southeastern England constantly. Every photograph had to reinforce the illusion. Patterson's team moved the dummy tanks periodically to simulate training exercises and pre-invasion preparations. They created tire tracks in the mud. They positioned real soldiers near the dummies doing maintenance activities. They even set up fake camouflage netting that was deliberately inadequate, allowing German reconnaissance to photograph tanks that looked like they were being hidden, but not hidden well enough. It was theater at the highest level, and the audience was Rommel, now commanding German defenses in France. Rommel fell for it. He argued repeatedly with Hitler about where the invasion would land, but even Rommel believed the evidence pointed to Calais. The reconnaissance photos showed massive Allied buildup in southeastern England. The signal intelligence confirmed Patton's army group was preparing for assault. The deception was so complete that even after Normandy began, Rommel wondered if he was watching a feint. The psychological impact of the deception extended beyond tactical surprise. German commanders spent the entire Normandy campaign second-guessing their intelligence. Every report could be a deception. Every reconnaissance photo could show dummy equipment. Every intercepted communication could be fake. The uncertainty paralyzed decision-making at critical moments. Units that should have been committed to the Normandy front were held in reserve, waiting for confirmation that turned out to be false. Reinforcements that could have reached the battlefield in hours took days because commanders wanted to verify they weren't responding to another Allied trick. Patterson watched the Normandy invasion from England. He wasn't part of the assault force, but his work had helped make it possible. On June 7, 1944, he received a message from Allied Forces headquarters thanking him for his contributions to the operation's success. The message was brief, generic, and classified. It didn't specify what contributions or what success. Patterson didn't need the clarification. He knew what he'd done. Later that week, he walked through the dummy tank deployments in Kent one more time. The inflatable Shermans were still positioned in perfect formation, gun barrels pointed southeast toward Calais. German reconnaissance was still photographing them. Hitler was still holding divisions in Calais, waiting for Patton's Phantom Army. The plywood and canvas from Egypt had evolved into rubber and compressed air in England, but the principle was unchanged. The enemy sees what you show them. Patterson stood there for a long time, looking at the fake tanks, thinking about the real soldiers landing on Normandy beaches, knowing that some of those men were alive because German panzers were 150 miles away defending against threats that didn't exist. It wasn't the kind of contribution that got you medals or parades. Nobody would write his name in history books. But the men who survived because the Germans were in the wrong place, they were real. That was enough. The final vindication of Patterson's methods came after the war during intelligence debriefings of captured German officers. Allied interrogators asked detailed questions about how German intelligence had assessed Allied strength and deployment. The answers were revealing. German photo interpreters had counted every tank visible in reconnaissance photos and treated them all as real. They had no procedure for identifying dummy equipment because they didn't believe the Allies would deploy dummies at such scale. A few German analysts had suggested that some photographed tanks might be decoys, but the suggestions were dismissed as unlikely. Building convincing dummy tanks would require too much effort and materials. The reasoning went. The Allies wouldn't waste resources on theater props when they needed every advantage for actual combat. That assumption was wrong, but it shaped German intelligence assessment for the entire war. Rommel's intelligence staff had estimated Allied tank strength at nearly double the actual numbers because they counted every tank in every photo as real. Patterson's dummies were indistinguishable from genuine equipment in aerial reconnaissance. The few times German forces actually encountered dummy positions, usually after overrunning Allied defensive lines, the discoveries were treated as isolated incidents rather than evidence of systematic deception. German command never adjusted their methodology, never implemented procedures for verifying photo intelligence with ground reconnaissance, never questioned whether the Allies might be conducting theater-scale deception operations. That failure was strategic. If you've watched this far, you clearly appreciate the depth and detail we put into these stories. I want to make one more ask before we wrap up. If this video provided value, if you learned something new about World War II history that you didn't know before, please like this video. It seems like a small thing, but it makes a huge difference in how YouTube promotes the content. More likes mean more people see these stories. More people seeing these stories means we can justify the time and research that goes into making them. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. We're building a community of people who care about the details, who want to understand not just what happened, but how it happened and why it mattered. That's you. Join us. The broader lesson from Patterson's story is about innovation under constraints. The British Army in 1942 needed more tanks to counter Rommel. They couldn't get more tanks. Manufacturing capacity was limited. Shipping capacity was limited. Time was limited. The approved solution was to wait for more tanks to be built and shipped, but waiting meant watching Rommel advance and men die. Patterson's solution was to build tanks that didn't work, but looked real enough to fool reconnaissance. The solution violated doctrine, wasted materials according to traditional metrics, and made professional intelligence officers uncomfortable. But it worked. It worked because Patterson understood the enemy's perspective. German reconnaissance operated at specific altitudes with specific camera capabilities. From that perspective, a well-built dummy tank was indistinguishable from a real one. The deception didn't need to fool ground troops or survive close inspection. It only needed to fool cameras at 8,000 feet. That was achievable with wood, canvas, and attention to detail. The contrast with official doctrine is instructive. Military organizations develop detailed procedures for every contingency. The procedures are based on experience, analysis, and institutional knowledge. They work most of the time, but they also create rigidity. When circumstances change faster than doctrine can adapt, the procedures become obstacles. Patterson faced that obstacle in June 1942. Doctrine said deception operations required weeks of planning and specialized equipment. Patterson had days and access to a lumber pile. Doctrine said engineering resources should be allocated to fortifications and infrastructure. Patterson allocated them to theater props. Doctrine said officers should follow chain of command and wait for authorization. Patterson built 40 tanks without permission and dealt with the consequences later. He was right, and doctrine was wrong. But being right didn't make the violation less serious. The only reason Patterson didn't get court-martialed was that his violation produced results. If the dummy tanks had failed, if German intelligence had identified them immediately, Patterson would have been punished for wasting resources and disobeying orders. Success was the only thing that made his actions acceptable in retrospect. That pattern repeats throughout military history. Innovation comes from individuals who see problems the institution doesn't recognize and solve them using methods the institution doesn't approve. Dalton's tripwire stopped scout cars but violated field manual regulations. Patterson's dummy tanks fooled Rommel but wasted engineering materials. Both men risked punishment to save lives. Both men were vindicated by results, not process. The institutions eventually adopted their methods, incorporated them into doctrine, and taught them to future soldiers. But the adoption came after the fact, after the innovation had proven itself in combat, after the individual risk-takers had demonstrated that the new method worked better than the approved alternative. That's how change happens in large organizations, not through committee decisions and formal proposals, through individuals who can't watch the current method fail anymore and decide to try something different, regardless of consequences. Richard Patterson's legacy is visible in every military deception operation conducted since World War II. The specific techniques have evolved. Modern dummy tanks are inflatable, not wood and canvas. Modern reconnaissance uses satellites and infrared sensors, not cameras at 8,000 feet. But the principle is identical. Identify what the enemy's sensors detect. Create signatures that match real equipment. Position them in credible contexts. Force the enemy to allocate resources against threats that don't exist. The U.S. military used these methods in Korea, Vietnam, and every subsequent conflict. Iraqi forces in 1991 positioned hundreds of dummy tanks and artillery pieces, hoping to draw American airstrikes away from real equipment. It didn't work as well as Patterson's deceptions because American reconnaissance technology had advanced beyond simple photography. But the attempt showed that the concept remained relevant. In any conflict where one side has better reconnaissance than the other, deception becomes valuable. The personal cost of innovation rarely gets discussed. Patterson risked court-martial. He violated direct orders. He diverted resources from approved uses to unauthorized projects. If his gamble had failed, his military career would have ended in disgrace. The 6 soldiers who helped him build those first 40 tanks took the same risk. They could have refused, reported Patterson to command, protected themselves. Instead, they worked for 72 hours without sleep building plywood tanks because they believed it might save lives. That decision required courage. Not the kind of courage that gets you medals, but the kind that makes you do the right thing when the approved method isn't working and the consequences of failure include personal destruction. Kowalski, Brennan, Vargas, Jackson, Williams, Chen. Those men went back to civilian life after the war. They didn't receive recognition for the tanks they built. Their contribution didn't appear in history books or documentary films, but they knew what they'd done. When Rommel diverted those panzer divisions based on fake intelligence from dummy tanks, when British forces held El Alamein and turned the tide in North Africa, when soldiers survived because German artillery was aimed at plywood instead of real positions, those 6 men knew they'd made a difference. That knowledge had to be enough because official recognition wasn't coming. Think about what that meant for them personally. These were ordinary soldiers, enlisted men following orders most of the time, suddenly asked to participate in something unauthorized and potentially career-ending. Kowalski had a wife and daughter back in Detroit. He was sending most of his pay home to support them. A court-martial would have meant losing that income, losing his benefits, going home in disgrace. Brennan had plans to go to college after the war on the GI Bill. A dishonorable discharge would have ended that dream. Vargas was the oldest son in a large family. His parents were proud that he was serving his country. How would he explain getting kicked out of the army for building fake tanks without permission? These weren't abstract risks. These were real consequences that could have destroyed their futures. And yet they all said yes when Patterson asked for volunteers. They all worked through the night. They all kept the secret. They all understood that doing the right thing sometimes means risking everything, and they did it anyway. That's the part of the story that nobody talks about because it doesn't fit the narrative of military precision and authorized operations, but it's the most important part. Innovation requires risk. Real risk. Personal risk. The kind that keeps you awake at night wondering if you just made the biggest mistake of your life. The story ends where it began, with a man standing in a field watching reconnaissance aircraft photograph fake equipment. The difference is perspective. In June 1942, Patterson stood in that field wondering if his gamble would work, if the dummy tanks would fool German intelligence, if he'd wasted critical resources on a failed experiment. By October 1942, he stood in similar fields, knowing the method worked, watching German planes photograph elaborate deceptions, understanding that every fake tank in every photo was one more piece of false information degrading enemy intelligence. The transformation from unauthorized risk to approved doctrine took 4 months. The transformation from obscure